The scream that emerged from the vicar's throat was not the genteel shriek one might expect from a man of the cloth, but rather a primal cry of shock that seemed to strip away decades of ecclesiastical composure in a single instant. Reverend William Ashford, who had served Maple Crossing for 32 years and had buried most of the village's elderly with practiced solemnity, found himself unable to articulate anything beyond a series of incoherent sounds that nevertheless conveyed their essential message to the gathering crowd. Within moments, the fete dissolved from ordered jubilation into chaos of the peculiar sort that only small villages experience. A chaos characterized not by panic, but by a kind of stunned confusion, as though the normal rules governing village life had suddenly been suspended. The constable, a methodical man named Robert Willis, who had been judging the jam competition when the alarm was raised, immediately secured the church and began the awkward process of moving people away from the scene while simultaneously attempting to preserve whatever evidence might exist. He was a competent enough officer for a village of Maple Crossing's size, having dealt with drunk and disorderly behavior, the occasional theft of garden implements, and one particularly memorable incident involving a sheep loose in the high street, but a murder, a genuine murder with a silver letter opener and a woman of Eleanor Hartley's standing, was decidedly beyond his customary purview. By the time the detective inspector from the county town arrived, some 90 minutes later, the entire village seemed to have congregated on the green, held back by police tape and the sheer weight of communal concern. Inspector Michael Graves was a tall man with sharp features and the kind of manner that suggested he had seen considerably more darkness in human nature than the average policeman, and he moved through the crowd with the detached focus of someone who had learned long ago not to be swayed by sentiment. His preliminary examination of the body, conducted in the presence of the village doctor and a police photographer who had arrived in his wake, suggested that Eleanor had been dead for approximately 2 hours, placing the time of death somewhere between 2:45 and 3:15 in the afternoon. The letter opener, which was indeed taken from the vicar's desk as Reverend Ashford confirmed with trembling certainty, had penetrated between the 4th and 5th ribs in a manner that suggested either considerable anatomical knowledge or remarkable luck. Eleanor's handbag lay beside her, its contents undisturbed, which immediately ruled out robbery as a motive and immediately raised the question of what, precisely, had motivated someone to stab the chairwoman of the village fete in the vestry of St. Michael's Church on a Saturday afternoon. It was during the inspector's initial interviews, conducted in the vicar's study with its comfortable chairs and faintly musty smell of old books, that the first contradictions began to emerge. Thomas Westbrook reported that he had seen Eleanor heading toward the church at approximately 2:45, accompanied by Mr. Adrian Cross, though, when confronted, Cross insisted that, while he had walked in that direction, Eleanor had departed from his company at the church gate, and he had not followed her inside. Catherine Nash, when questioned, admitted with apparent reluctance that she had observed Eleanor and Cross in what might be described as animated conversation near the flower stall some 20 minutes before Eleanor's disappearance, though she insisted she had not overheard their discussion. The doctor's wife, Margaret Hadley, volunteered that Eleanor had seemed rather agitated when they had spoken earlier, though she was unable or unwilling to specify the nature of their conversation with any precision. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, who had remained on the periphery throughout the afternoon's unfolding drama, had quietly observed Inspector Graves's initial inquiries with the kind of patient attention that most people mistook for simple elderly distraction. She had noted, for instance, that Thomas Westbrook's left hand bore a fresh plaster across the knuckles, which he had not possessed that morning when he was arranging the dahlias. She had observed that Catherine Nash's engagement ring, which normally caught the light so aggressively, had been removed and was now absent from her left hand entirely. She had also noticed that Adrian Cross's cufflinks, which were clearly expensive and clearly distinctive, small silver crosses mounted in what appeared to be sapphires, had left a faint mark on Eleanor's grey sleeve where the body lay, a mark that suggested physical contact more recent than a passing greeting. The vicar, for his part, remained nearly catatonic with shock, repeatedly insisting that his vestry had been locked all afternoon, a claim that created an immediate problem for Inspector Graves's emerging theory about the crime. If the vestry had indeed been locked, then either Eleanor had been killed elsewhere and the body moved, which seemed unlikely given the substantial quantity of blood that remained in situ, or the vicar's memory was playing tricks, or someone possessed a key to the vestry other than the vicar himself. This last possibility opened up an entirely new dimension to the investigation, one that suggested premeditation and planning rather than crime of passion. By the time evening had descended upon Maple Crossing and the fete's decorative bunting hung in sodden disarray, following the rain that had indeed arrived as predicted, the village seemed transformed into something altogether darker and more complicated than it had appeared that morning. The investigators had established a temporary headquarters in the village hall, and Inspector Graves had begun the process of taking comprehensive statements from every person who had been present on the green that afternoon. Miss Marple, having provided her own statement with her customary precision and vagueness. She had seen this and observed that, but she was really rather unreliable about such details and shouldn't be trusted, had returned to her cottage and settled into her armchair with her knitting, her needles clicking softly as she contemplated the various threads of human behavior that had been exposed by Eleanor Hartley's death. The real investigation, she understood with the clarity born of 8 decades of observation, was only just beginning. The morning after Eleanor Hartley's death broke grey and reluctant over Maple Crossing, as though the village itself had aged overnight and was struggling to adjust to its altered circumstances. Inspector Graves had established a more formal investigation headquarters in the village hall, where 2 additional detectives had arrived from the county town with files and evidence bags and the kind of methodical determination that suggested they viewed the case as a puzzle requiring systematic solution rather than a tragedy requiring compassionate handling. By 9 o'clock, as the village went through the motions of a Sunday that felt fundamentally wrong, the church bells rang as scheduled, but with a mournful quality that seemed to reflect the collective unease. The investigation had already begun to reveal the extraordinary complexity of Eleanor Hartley's life and her relationships within the community. It emerged, quite quickly, that Eleanor's financial circumstances were considerably more strained than her appearance and demeanor had suggested. Her accountant, summoned by the inspector and questioned with considerably less delicacy than the situation might have warranted, revealed that Eleanor had been living substantially beyond her means for the past 3 years, drawing down her capital at an alarming rate and making increasingly desperate inquiries about the possibility of mortgaging her estate. This information transformed the investigation entirely, shifting focus from crime of passion to crime of financial desperation, and immediately elevated Adrian Cross to the status of prime suspect. The wealthy businessman from London, it transpired, had arrived in Maple Crossing precisely 6 months prior, almost immediately following a period when Eleanor had made her first substantial financial inquiries, and he had demonstrated a remarkable interest in Eleanor's property and holdings. Neighbors reported seeing his expensive motor car parked outside her house on multiple evenings, and one particularly gossipy villager mentioned that Eleanor had been observed laughing, in a manner that seemed rather unlike her previous reserved comportment, a detail that suggested romance, or at least the careful cultivation of romantic possibility. Yet when Inspector Graves pressed Cross on the nature of his relationship with Eleanor, the businessman maintained with unwavering consistency that their connection was purely professional, relating to a potential business venture involving the development of Maple Lodge's grounds for a small boutique hotel project that Eleanor had apparently been considering as an investment opportunity. This claim was partially corroborated by documents found in Eleanor's study, architectural sketches and preliminary business proposals, but the inspector remained skeptical, particularly given the evidence of Eleanor's financial desperation and the fact that such a venture would have required substantial capital investment that Eleanor simply did not possess. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had taken the unusual step of visiting the village shop on Sunday morning, ostensibly to purchase knitting wool, but in reality to observe the social dynamics that were rapidly crystallizing in Eleanor's absence. The shop, as it always was on Sunday mornings, served as a kind of informal community center where village gossip was exchanged with the efficiency of a stock market trading floor, and the current commodity being traded was speculation about who had murdered Eleanor Hartley and why. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Ashford, was present, her normally gentle demeanor shadowed by shock and the complex emotion of finding one's church transformed into a crime scene. She mentioned, somewhat hesitantly, that she had observed Thomas Westbrook entering the church through the side door, the one that led directly to the vestry, at approximately 2:30 on Saturday afternoon, though she had assumed he was delivering flowers for Eleanor's planned floral arrangement in the sanctuary. This detail, Miss Marple noted, had apparently not yet been shared with Inspector Graves, at least not in any systematic way, and it suggested that the young farmer possessed knowledge or involvement that he had not yet disclosed. The vicar's wife also mentioned, in the way that village women do when they are not quite accusing but are certainly insinuating, that Thomas's fiancée, Catherine, had seemed remarkably composed throughout the previous afternoon's chaos, almost as though she had been expecting something dramatic to occur, though this observation was immediately qualified by the disclaimer that one could never really know what people were thinking, and that Catherine had always been somewhat reserved anyway. By the time Miss Marple left the shop, her wool safely secured in her wicker basket, she had acquired considerably more information than she had expected, though considerably less clarity about what that information actually signified. The pieces of the puzzle were accumulating, but they seemed to point in multiple directions simultaneously, like a compass in a magnetic storm. That afternoon, she paid a visit to the rectory under the guise of inquiring about the vicar's well-being following his traumatic discovery, a gesture of pastoral concern that allowed her to observe Reverend Ashford in his domestic setting and to examine, with the casual thoroughness of someone examining a floral arrangement, the study where Eleanor's body had been found. The vestry door, which led from the study, was indeed locked as the vicar had insisted, and Miss Marple examined the lock with interest, noting that it was an old mechanism, the kind that could be opened by several different keys depending on the age and maintenance of the tumbler. The vicar mentioned, almost conversationally as he poured her tea, that there had been a missing key for several years. A spare vestry key that had gone missing when the church had been undergoing renovation approximately 7 years prior. He had never thought it particularly significant, assuming it had been lost by whoever had done the work, but now he wondered if that missing key might be relevant to the investigation. It was this observation that seemed to crystallize something in Miss Marple's mind, a sense that the pieces, while still pointing in multiple directions, were beginning to form a pattern that made a particular kind of sense. She left the rectory with her knitting bag no heavier than it had been when she arrived, but her understanding of Eleanor Hartley's death considerably more complex, and her suspicion pointing toward a direction that the inspector, with all his training and methodology, had not yet considered. By Monday morning, the investigation had acquired the kind of momentum that small villages experience when they suddenly become the center of official attention, with additional personnel arriving from the county town and the media beginning to circle like birds of prey, sensing weakness in the herd. Inspector Graves had established a formal timeline and was methodically working through the details of each suspect's movements and relationships, yet Miss Marple observed from her position on the periphery that the inspector seemed to be constructing his narrative with a kind of premature certainty, as though he had already decided upon Adrian Cross's guilt and was now merely gathering the evidence to support that conclusion. This was, in her experience, precisely the sort of cognitive error that allowed the truly guilty to escape scrutiny while the merely suspicious were railroaded into confession. On Monday afternoon, a development occurred that seemed to confirm the inspector's suspicions while simultaneously introducing an entirely new dimension to the case. One of the detectives, conducting a thorough search of Adrian Cross's rented accommodation at Maple Lodge, discovered a substantial sum of cash, nearly £10,000, hidden in the mattress of the master bedroom, along with a plane ticket to Argentina dated for the following Tuesday. Cross, when confronted with this evidence, initially maintained his composure but eventually admitted, with a kind of weary resignation, that he had indeed been involved in a financial scheme with Eleanor, though he insisted vehemently that the scheme was legitimate and that Eleanor was still alive and in good health when he had last seen her on Saturday afternoon. The scheme itself, when fully revealed through documents and correspondence, proved to be considerably more elaborate than the hotel development story that Cross had initially offered. Eleanor had been promised a substantial return on a real estate investment in South America, a return that would have solved her financial difficulties entirely, but the investment required the transfer of a significant portion of her capital to Cross's personal accounts for what he claimed were currency conversion and administrative fees. This was, by any reasonable assessment, precisely the sort of arrangement that one encountered in confidence schemes, and the presence of the cash and the plane ticket suggested that Cross had been planning to abscond with Eleanor's money and disappear to South America before the fraud could be discovered. Yet, when Inspector Graves pressed the businessman about Eleanor's whereabouts on Saturday afternoon and whether he had in fact followed her into the church, Cross's answers became increasingly evasive and contradictory, eventually requiring the presence of a solicitor before any further questioning could proceed. This development seemed to satisfy the inspector considerably, as it painted a clear picture of motive. Financial desperation on Eleanor's part, combined with Cross's desire to escape with the funds before his scheme could be exposed, and it suggested an opportunity for the crime that the inspector had been struggling to construct. If Cross had indeed followed Eleanor into the church, waited for an opportune moment when the vestry was briefly unoccupied, and used the missing key that he had somehow acquired to gain access to that space, then he would have had the means and the opportunity to commit the murder. The only remaining question was whether the jury would accept the absence of any witnesses to the actual killing and the lack of any clear evidence connecting Cross to the missing vestry key. It was precisely this point of uncertainty that seemed to trouble Miss Marple, who on Tuesday morning found herself conversing with the village postmistress, a woman named Dorothy Finch, who had held her position for 40 years and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Maple Crossing's inhabitants and their habits. Dorothy mentioned, almost in passing, that she had noticed Thomas Westbrook collecting his post somewhat more frequently than usual over the past month, and that she had observed him speaking rather intently with Adrian Cross outside the post office on at least 2 occasions in the weeks prior to Eleanor's death. This detail seemed insignificant in isolation, yet it introduced a possibility that neither Miss Marple nor, apparently, Inspector Graves had fully considered: that Thomas Westbrook and Adrian Cross might possess a prior connection or arrangement, and that this connection might be considerably more significant than either man had admitted during questioning. That afternoon, Miss Marple resolved to conduct an investigation of her own, making use of the network of village knowledge that had accumulated over her decades of residence in Maple Crossing. She visited the library, ostensibly to return a book, but in reality to consult with the librarian, who mentioned that Thomas Westbrook had borrowed several books on agricultural development and property financing in recent months, a detail that suggested he was considering substantial changes to his farm operations. She visited the church and examined the vestry lock with considerably more thoroughness than her previous visit had permitted, noting the wear patterns on the mechanism and the type of key that would have been required to open it. She even found occasion to speak with Catherine Nash, Eleanor's successor as the primary coordinator for the village's social events, and observed that the younger woman seemed unusually eager to distance herself from any involvement with Eleanor's affairs, almost as though she were anxious to establish her complete innocence in advance of any accusation. By the time evening had descended on Tuesday, Miss Marple had accumulated a collection of observations that, while still disparate and seemingly unconnected, were beginning to form a pattern that contradicted Inspector Graves's emerging narrative. The inspector's theory required Adrian Cross to be the sole actor in Eleanor's murder, but the evidence suggested instead a considerably more complex arrangement involving multiple parties with overlapping motives and interconnected interests. Someone, Miss Marple understood, with the clarity that came from decades of observing human nature, had orchestrated a remarkably clever deception that was designed to point the investigation toward a false suspect while allowing the true perpetrator to escape notice entirely. The question that occupied her thoughts as she settled into her armchair with her knitting was not who had killed Eleanor Hartley, but rather who had arranged for someone else to be blamed for the crime. Wednesday morning brought with it a development that seemed to confirm Inspector Graves' theory, while simultaneously undermining its fundamental logic in ways that only Miss Marple appeared to recognize. Adrian Cross's solicitor announced that his client was prepared to make a partial confession, admitting to the financial fraud but vehemently maintaining his innocence regarding Eleanor's death. Cross claimed that he had indeed followed Eleanor toward the church on Saturday afternoon, hoping to convince her to accelerate the investment timeline, but that she had turned him away at the gate, insisting that she required time to consider the proposal more carefully. According to his account, he had returned to the fete grounds and had spent the remainder of the afternoon in the company of several witnesses who could corroborate his movements. When the inspector's detectives verified this claim, they discovered that it was substantially accurate. Multiple villagers confirmed seeing Cross on the green between 3 and 4:30 on Saturday afternoon, which was considerably later than Eleanor's estimated time of death. This development should have eliminated Cross from consideration as the murderer, yet the inspector seemed reluctant to release his primary suspect, instead suggesting that perhaps Cross had hired someone to commit the murder on his behalf, a theory for which he possessed no evidence whatsoever and which seemed increasingly desperate as the hours progressed. It was precisely at this moment of investigative stagnation that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Westbrook appeared at her cottage door on Wednesday afternoon, his expression troubled and his manner suggesting that he labored under the weight of considerable internal conflict. He sat in her parlor, accepting tea that he seemed disinclined to drink, and eventually unburdened himself of information that he had apparently been wrestling with since Eleanor's death. He admitted that he had indeed entered the church on Saturday afternoon, though not for the purpose of delivering flowers, as Mrs. Ashford had assumed. Rather, he had been meeting Eleanor in the vestry at her request, as she had wished to discuss a matter of considerable delicacy regarding his engagement to Catherine Nash. Eleanor, it transpired, had possessed information regarding Catherine's background and previous circumstances that she believed Thomas ought to know before proceeding with the marriage. Catherine, Eleanor had informed him, was not in fact the head mistress of the primary school under her own name, but had rather adopted that identity approximately 2 years prior, following a period of residence in the south of France that had been necessitated by certain difficulties involving her previous life and associations. These difficulties, while not involving criminal activity of which Eleanor was aware, had apparently involved a romantic entanglement with a married man of considerable prominence, resulting in complications that had ultimately driven Catherine to establish a new life under a modified version of her birth name in a location where her previous existence would not follow her. Thomas had entered the vestry at approximately 2:40, expecting to receive this information privately, but had discovered instead that Eleanor had not yet arrived. He had waited for approximately 5 minutes, becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the venue and the circumstances, before departing through the side door and returning to the fete grounds. He had not observed Eleanor anywhere on the church grounds, and he had certainly not encountered her in the vestry or observed her body. The revelation that Eleanor had possessed damaging information about Catherine, combined with the fact that Catherine appeared to have lied about her background and apparently concealed this fabrication from Thomas, transformed the investigation's direction entirely. Inspector Graves, when informed of this development by Miss Marple herself, who had persuaded Thomas that full disclosure to the authorities was his only ethical course, immediately pivoted his investigative focus toward Catherine Nash. A careful search of Catherine's residence, conducted with a warrant that the inspector hastily obtained, revealed a collection of documents suggesting that her background was considerably more complicated than she had represented. She had indeed lived in France under an assumed name, had been involved in a relationship with a married politician, and had engaged in what might charitably be described as blackmail to extract herself from that situation. More significantly, investigators discovered a copy of a letter that Eleanor had written but apparently never sent. A letter that detailed Eleanor's intention to confront Catherine regarding her deceptions and to demand that she withdraw from her engagement to Thomas, as Eleanor believed the younger woman was fundamentally dishonest and unsuitable as a marriage partner. The letter, dated Friday of the week preceding the murder, suggested that Eleanor had been planning to intervene in Thomas's life in a manner that Catherine would certainly have found intolerable. When Catherine was brought in for questioning on Thursday morning, she initially denied any involvement in Eleanor's death, but gradually, as the inspector presented the accumulating evidence of her deceptions and her lies about her background, she began to crack under the psychological pressure of exposure. She admitted that she had known Eleanor intended to speak with Thomas, that she had overheard a portion of Eleanor's conversation with the vicar's wife on Saturday morning regarding the meeting planned for that afternoon, and that the prospect of her engagement being destroyed by Eleanor's interference had driven her to a state of considerable distress. Yet even as Catherine acknowledged her dishonesty and her motive for wanting Eleanor dead, she continued to insist with apparent sincerity that she had not actually killed the older woman. She admitted to being present near the church on Saturday afternoon, admitted to witnessing Thomas entering through the side door, admitted to experiencing a moment of terrible temptation when she realized that Eleanor was alone in the vestry. But she swore with increasing desperation that she had not entered the building herself and had not committed the murder. And as Miss Marple listened to Catherine's interrogation through the one-way mirror that the inspector had graciously permitted her to observe, she understood with complete certainty that Catherine Nash was telling the truth. The impasse that had developed by Thursday afternoon was precisely the sort that frustrated modern police investigation, which relied upon systematic evidence and logical progression toward an identifiable perpetrator. Yet Miss Marple understood that the frustration itself was revealing. Inspector Graves possessed multiple suspects with established motives: Adrian Cross with his financial fraud, Catherine Nash with her exposure and humiliation, Thomas Westbrook with his betrayal by a woman who had attempted to manipulate his personal decisions. Yet none of these suspects fit the evidentiary pattern in a manner that was entirely satisfactory. This impossibility suggested to Miss Marple that the investigation had been approaching the crime from an incorrect foundational assumption, and that the true murderer was someone whom the police had not yet seriously considered or had dismissed as insufficiently motivated. On Friday morning, Miss Marple requested a private meeting with Inspector Graves, a request that the inspector granted with the kind of weary politeness that suggested he viewed the elderly woman as a well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful observer. She presented her observations with characteristic indirection, beginning with seemingly innocuous details about village life and social dynamics, before gradually building toward her central argument. She mentioned, for instance, the detail that Adrian Cross's cufflinks had left a mark on Eleanor's sleeve, a detail that suggested physical contact, yet Cross had admitted only to speaking with Eleanor at the gate and had not mentioned any physical contact whatsoever. She noted that the vestry lock, while old, showed no signs of forcing, suggesting that whoever had opened it had possessed a key or had been let inside by Eleanor herself. She observed that Thomas Westbrook's injured hand, which bore the fresh plaster on Saturday afternoon, suggested recent violence, yet none of the injuries that would result from stabbing someone matched the character of his wound. She mentioned that Catherine Nash, despite her deceptions and her motive, lacked any opportunity to commit the murder because she had been observed near the church grounds without having actually entered the building. And then, most significantly, She directed the inspector's attention to a detail that had been present throughout the investigation, yet overlooked in the rush to secure a suspect: the fact that Reverend William Ashford had discovered Eleanor's body in a locked vestry. Yet the inspector had never adequately explained how the murder weapon had come to be positioned as it was, or how Eleanor's body had come to be arranged with such apparent care and deliberation. The vicar, Miss Marple suggested gently, had been present in the church throughout the afternoon. The vicar possessed the only functional key to the vestry. The vicar had access to the letter opener, which was his own property, and the vicar, most significantly, had been experiencing considerable financial and personal difficulties that Eleanor, in her capacity as chairwoman of the parish committee, had learned about and had been threatening to expose to the bishop unless Reverend Ashford resigned his position and vacated the rectory. This last detail emerged from correspondence that the inspector, upon Miss Marple's suggestion, hastily obtained from Eleanor's house. Correspondence in which Eleanor had documented her intention to force the vicar's removal from Maple Crossing on the grounds of his unsuitability for the position, grounds that related to debts incurred through gambling and an inappropriate emotional attachment to a male member of the congregation that Eleanor viewed as unsuitable and potentially scandalous. The inspector's initial response was skepticism, born from the understandable human reluctance to believe that a man of the cloth could commit murder, yet the logic of Miss Marple's argument was inexorable. When Reverend Ashford was brought in for more intensive questioning, the careful presentation of this evidence, combined with the psychological weight of confronting a woman who had clearly deduced his guilt and the understanding that his deception had been transparent to her all along, caused the Reverend's carefully maintained composure to disintegrate entirely. He admitted, first hesitantly and then with increasing desperation, that he had indeed killed Eleanor, though he framed the act as something less than premeditated murder, claiming that it had been an impulse born of desperation and panic when Eleanor had confronted him in the vestry with her ultimatum. He had requested the meeting ostensibly to discuss parish finances, but Eleanor had used the occasion to present her demands: his resignation and departure from Maple Crossing within the month, or she would submit her documentation to the bishop and ensure his public humiliation. In the moment of his desperation, faced with the destruction of everything he had built over 3 decades, he had seized the letter opener and struck out, acting without genuine intention to kill, but finding himself unable to stop once he had begun. The confession, once it emerged, brought with it the terrible clarity of human weakness exposed to the light. Reverend Ashford had indeed locked the vestry door afterward, using the spare key that he had found in the church's office several years prior, a key that had never been truly lost, but rather had been misplaced in a location where it would eventually be discovered by him. He had briefly considered fleeing, but had ultimately decided that discovery and confession might be preferable to a lifetime of deception, and so he had returned to the fete, gathered his composure, and waited for the inevitable moment when Eleanor would be discovered and he would be called upon to perform his role in the tragedy that would unfold. By Friday evening, as the sun descended over Maple Crossing in shades of amber and grey, the investigation had reached its conclusion, yet the village itself seemed to have acquired a different character, as though the discovery of evil within its most sacred institution had fundamentally altered the communal understanding of safety and sanctity that had previously defined it. The week following Reverend Ashford's confession was characterized by a peculiar quality of anticlimax that seemed to permeate Maple Crossing like fog settling over the village green. The investigation, which had consumed the energies and anxieties of the community for nearly a week, was suddenly concluded, yet the resolution brought with it none of the satisfaction that one might have expected from the apprehension of a murderer. Rather, the discovery that their vicar, a man who had christened most of the children in the village, who had married many of them, who had buried their parents and grandparents with practiced solemnity, was capable of murder, introduced a kind of psychological vertigo that made the ordinary rhythms of village life feel uncertain and unreliable. Inspector Graves departed on Saturday morning, leaving behind a small team of detectives to conduct the final paperwork and prepare the case for prosecution, which was expected to proceed with considerable speed given Ashford's confession and the substantial evidence that had accumulated during the investigation. The inspector made a particular point of acknowledging Miss Marple's contributions to the case, a gesture that seemed to surprise him even as he was making it, as though he had not fully anticipated that an elderly woman, armed with nothing more than observational acuity and an understanding of human nature, could prove more effective than his own trained methodology. He suggested, with a kind of professional delicacy, that Miss Marple might consider a career in criminal investigation, a suggestion that she received with her customary gentle smile and her assurance that she was far too old to begin such a venture and that she was perfectly content to observe the human condition from the periphery rather than to become entangled in its darker manifestations. Yet the conclusion of the formal investigation did not mark the true conclusion of the case's impact upon Maple Crossing, for the discovery of Reverend Ashford's guilt had unleashed a cascade of secondary revelations that continued to unfold as the village grappled with the implications of his confession. The young male parishioner with whom Eleanor had believed the vicar to have an inappropriate attachment came forward, somewhat reluctantly, to clarify that while he had indeed been the object of Ashford's emotional focus, the relationship had been entirely one-sided and had involved no physical impropriety whatsoever. The parishioner, a sensitive young man named Geoffrey Hartwell, who worked as an art teacher at the secondary school, had been unaware of the nature of the vicar's feelings until Eleanor's correspondence was made public, and he was devastated by the realization that his innocent friendship had been misinterpreted and had contributed to the tragic events that had unfolded. Thomas Westbrook, freed from any suspicion of involvement in Eleanor's death, found his engagement to Catherine Nash thrown into considerable uncertainty by the revelations regarding Catherine's deceptions and her concealed background. The couple attempted to weather the scandal for several weeks, but the fundamental breach of trust that had been exposed, Catherine's dishonesty regarding her identity and her past, combined with Eleanor's intervention in Thomas's personal decisions, ultimately proved insurmountable. By mid-October, Catherine withdrew from her position as head mistress of the primary school, citing personal reasons, and departed Maple Crossing for a location undisclosed, presumably to begin yet another reinvention of her identity in a community where her complicated history would not precede her. Adrian Cross, his fraudulent scheme exposed, and his business dealings now under investigation by authorities far more sophisticated than the village constabulary, negotiated a settlement arrangement with Eleanor's estate and departed Maple Lodge with considerably less dignity and considerably more legal liability than he had anticipated when he had first arrived in Maple Crossing, with his tailored suits and his expensive cufflinks. The village hotel project, which had been at the center of his financial manipulation, was abandoned entirely, leaving the architectural sketches and preliminary designs scattered like detritus in Eleanor's study, monuments to ambitions that had been founded upon deception and greed. The parish itself faced considerable uncertainty regarding its future, as the Church of England's administrative hierarchy grappled with the question of how to proceed following a vicar's conviction for murder. A temporary replacement was arranged, a younger man named David Thornton, who arrived with his family and his considerable enthusiasm for modernizing the church's approach to community engagement, though the parishioners seemed reluctant to invest their emotional energy in a new incumbent when the previous one had so thoroughly shattered their sense of security. Miss Marple observed these developments with her characteristic combination of compassion and detachment, understanding that the true tragedy of Eleanor Hartley's death extended far beyond the fact of the murder itself, encompassing instead the destruction of reputations, relationships, and the fundamental assumption that a small village could somehow isolate itself from the complications and darkness that characterized human nature more broadly. She had been proven correct in her deduction regarding the vicar's guilt, yet the knowledge of his motivation, the desperation born from exposure, The panic induced by the threat of humiliation, the terrible human capacity for violence when faced with the dissolution of one's carefully constructed social position, filled her not with satisfaction, but with a profound melancholy regarding the weakness and fear that seemed to animate so much of human behavior. She found herself, in the weeks following Ashford's arrest, returning frequently to the church, not for the religious services that continued under Mr. Thornton's guidance, but rather to sit quietly in a pew and contemplate the strange duality of sacred space. How a building dedicated to grace and forgiveness could simultaneously harbor violence and betrayal. How the desire to protect one's dignity and reputation could override the fundamental moral principles that the building itself professed to embody. By November, as autumn descended fully upon Maple Crossing and the village began its transition toward winter, the immediate crisis had faded from the forefront of communal consciousness, though its residual effects continued to influence the social dynamics and relationships that had been fractured by the investigation and its revelations. Life resumed its ordinary patterns, yet with a subtle shift in the village's understanding of itself, a recognition that evil did not announce itself through obvious signs, but rather emerged quietly from within institutions and individuals that had appeared to embody virtue and stability. It was precisely at the moment when Maple Crossing seemed to be settling into a new equilibrium that a development occurred which suggested the investigation was considerably less concluded than anyone had imagined. A letter arrived at the police station on a grey November morning, addressed to Inspector Graves in care of the village constabulary, a letter that was postmarked from London and bore no return address. The letter, written in a precise and educated hand, contained information that seemed to contradict the fundamental narrative that had been accepted as established fact regarding Eleanor Hartley's murder. The anonymous correspondent claimed to possess knowledge that Reverend Ashford's confession had been incomplete, that he had confessed to the murder but had omitted certain crucial details regarding his motivation and the circumstances that had driven him to commit the crime. More significantly, the letter suggested that Eleanor Hartley had not been murdered because of her threat to expose Ashford's gambling debts and emotional entanglements, but rather because she had possessed knowledge of something considerably more serious, knowledge that implicated Ashford in criminal activity that extended far beyond personal indiscretion into the realm of genuine law-breaking. The letter provided no specifics regarding the nature of this criminal activity, but it suggested that Eleanor's threat to expose Ashford's misconduct in the church had been motivated not by moral disapproval of his personal weaknesses, but by her discovery that these weaknesses had rendered him vulnerable to manipulation and involvement in activities that endangered the community itself. Inspector Graves, who had been preparing to close his files and return to the county town with the satisfaction of a resolved case, found himself suddenly confronted with the possibility that the investigation had merely scratched the surface of a considerably more complex situation. He requested that Miss Marple meet with him at the village constabulary, a request that she accepted with apparent reluctance, as though she had hoped to be relieved of the burden of investigation and observation that had consumed her energies since Eleanor's death. Yet when she arrived at the constabulary and was shown into the inspector's temporary office, she seemed unsurprised by the letter's contents, as though she had been expecting precisely this development and had merely been waiting for the official investigation to catch up to her own private conclusions. When asked directly whether she had anticipated that Ashford's confession might be incomplete, Miss Marple responded with characteristic indirection, suggesting that human confession was rarely a simple matter of complete disclosure, but rather a complex negotiation between guilt, shame, and the human desire to minimize one's culpability. She noted, almost conversationally, that while Ashford had confessed to Eleanor's murder, he had not confessed to how he had come to be in such desperate financial circumstances that gambling and the accumulation of significant debt had become possible within the context of a clerical position that provided neither substantial income nor access to funds. She suggested that the gambling debts themselves might be a symptom of a deeper problem, a problem that involved either coercion or involvement in activities that had generated both the financial desperation and the vulnerability that Eleanor had apparently discovered. When the inspector pressed her on what she believed that problem to be, Miss Marple admitted, with considerable reluctance, that she had developed suspicions regarding the involvement of certain influential village figures in activities that extended beyond the normal range of village misconduct into territory that might genuinely endanger community welfare. She suggested, delicately, that the inspector examine the financial records of the church more carefully than he had thus far done, and that he pay particular attention to the flow of funds through accounts that ostensibly existed for charitable purposes, but which might have served alternative functions. She also suggested that he investigate the relationship between Reverend Ashford and a businessman named Martin Caldwell, a figure who had appeared occasionally in village life over the past 5 years, and who had maintained what appeared to be a professional relationship with the vicar, a relationship that had generated considerable cash flow in directions that seemed inconsistent with legitimate charitable activity. The inspector, acting upon Miss Marple's suggestions with the kind of deference born from his previous experience of her investigative acuity, instructed his team to conduct a comprehensive examination of the church's financial records and to trace the movements of funds that had passed through various accounts. What emerged from this investigation was a revelation that seemed to dwarf Eleanor's murder in its scope and implications. The Church of England's charitable accounts had been used for several years as a conduit for money laundering operations that served organized crime interests operating throughout the southern counties. Reverend Ashford, through his relationship with Martin Caldwell, had become complicit in this criminal enterprise, providing the legitimacy and institutional credibility necessary for the laundering operation to function effectively. Eleanor, in her capacity as a woman who understood financial matters and who had taken an interest in the church's administrative operations, had discovered the irregular transactions and had begun to investigate their source. Her threat to expose Ashford had not been born primarily from moral disapproval of his personal failings, but rather from her growing realization that he was involved in criminal activity on a scale that endangered the entire community. Ashford's confession to murder had been genuinely motivated by Eleanor's threat, but the desperation that had driven him to kill had its source not merely in fear of personal exposure, but in the understanding that his exposure would necessarily expose the criminal enterprise that he had been serving, and that Martin Caldwell and his associates would view any threat to that operation as a threat requiring elimination. The discovery of the money laundering scheme transformed the investigation entirely, shifting focus from a crime of passion to a crime motivated by protection out of a considerably larger criminal enterprise. Martin Caldwell was arrested within days, his financial records seized, and his contacts traced through an investigation that eventually expanded beyond Maple Crossing to encompass networks that extended throughout 3 counties and involved dozens of individuals. Yet, as the investigation expanded and became increasingly complex, Miss Marple found herself withdrawing from involvement, understanding that the case had evolved beyond the domain of village observation and human psychology into territory governed by professional law enforcement and the investigation of organized crime. She had solved Eleanor Hartley's murder, but in doing so, she had uncovered evidence of crimes that would occupy official investigators for months to come. Crimes that bore no relation to the small-town drama that had initially seemed to encompass the case's totality. By late November, as the investigation into the money laundering operation expanded into a complex federal matter that required the involvement of authorities far beyond the county constabulary, Maple Crossing found itself transformed into something altogether different from the village it had been only weeks prior. The revelation of Reverend Ashford's involvement in organized crime, combined with the discovery that the Church of England's charitable mechanisms had been corrupted to serve criminal purposes, generated a scandal that extended far beyond the village boundaries and reached into the ecclesiastical hierarchy itself. The Archbishop's office issued statements expressing shock and dismay. Commissions were established to audit church finances across multiple dioceses, and what had begun as a single murder investigation had metastasized into a comprehensive examination of institutional vulnerability to criminal infiltration. Yet amid this expanding complexity, Miss Marple found herself drawn back into the investigation through a mechanism that she had not anticipated and which suggested that the case was considerably less resolved than the authorities had believed. Inspector Graves appeared at her cottage door one morning in early December, his expression suggesting that he labored under considerable frustration regarding some aspect of the investigation that he felt unable to resolve through conventional methodologies. He explained that while the evidence against Reverend Ashford regarding Eleanor's murder remained solid and his confession continued to hold, certain aspects of the broader criminal enterprise remained puzzling to investigators. Specifically, the money laundering operation had been remarkably sophisticated and had functioned effectively for several years without detection, which suggested that it enjoyed considerable protection from within institutional structures. Yet Ashford, when interrogated regarding his role in the criminal enterprise and regarding the identity of other individuals involved, had maintained consistent silence, refusing to provide any information that might further implicate his associates or provide investigators with leads regarding the broader network. This refusal to cooperate was unusual, the inspector noted, because Ashford possessed no apparent loyalty to the criminal organization that he served, and his silence seemed motivated by something other than traditional criminal code or fear of retaliation. Rather, it seemed as though Ashford had made a deliberate choice to limit his confession to the murder of Eleanor Hartley and to refuse to provide any assistance regarding the investigation of the financial crimes that had been discovered in its wake. This suggested, Miss Marple observed with quiet certainty, that Ashford was protecting someone and that this protection was motivated by something more powerful than fear or criminal allegiance. She suggested to the inspector that he investigate whether Ashford had family members who might be implicated in the criminal enterprise or whether he harbored emotional attachments to individuals who might benefit from his silence. The inspector, acting upon this suggestion, discovered that Ashford possessed a younger brother named Thomas Ashford, who had been estranged from the vicar for nearly a decade but who had recently re-established contact with him and who had, according to financial investigators, been receiving substantial payments from the money laundering operation in the months preceding Eleanor's murder. The younger Ashford, it appeared, had become involved with Martin Caldwell's criminal enterprise through gambling debts incurred at illegal gaming establishments, debts that had accumulated to a point where physical harm seemed imminent unless payment could be arranged. The older Ashford, discovering his younger brother's predicament, had agreed to facilitate the use of church charitable accounts for the laundering operation, not from any genuine allegiance to Caldwell or the criminal enterprise, but rather from the familial desperation that drove one sibling to sacrifice his own moral integrity to save another from destruction. This revelation transformed the understanding of the crime once again, suggesting that Eleanor's murder had not been committed by a man motivated by selfish preservation of his reputation, but rather by a man acting out of fraternal loyalty and a desire to protect his younger brother from the consequences of criminal involvement. When confronted with this understanding, Reverend Ashford broke his silence regarding the broader criminal enterprise, not from any desire to cooperate with authorities, but rather to establish that his brother's involvement had been minimal and coerced, and that his younger sibling should be viewed as a victim of criminal manipulation rather than as a willing participant in organized crime. The inspector's investigation, guided by the information that Ashford finally provided, was able to construct a considerably more comprehensive understanding of the criminal network's operations, identifying multiple individuals involved in the laundering scheme and providing evidence that would ultimately result in prosecutions extending across 3 counties and involving financial crimes totaling nearly £5 million. Yet as the investigation expanded and achieved its objectives, Miss Marple found herself contemplating a peculiar moral ambiguity that the case had revealed. Reverend Ashford had committed murder, a genuine crime against another human being. Yet his motivation for that murder had been rooted in familial loyalty and desperation rather than in malice or selfish preservation of reputation. His subsequent silence regarding the broader criminal enterprise had been motivated by desire to protect his brother from destruction, a motivation that, while criminal in its consequences, emerged from profoundly human emotional foundations. The criminal enterprise itself, while deserving of exposure and prosecution, had preyed upon human weakness and desperation, upon gambling addiction, upon financial vulnerability, upon the kind of family loyalty that could be manipulated into cooperation with evil. Justice, Miss Marple understood as she contemplated these complexities from her sitting room in December, was considerably less simple than the law suggested, and the triumph of official investigation and prosecution carried with it a kind of melancholy recognition that the true roots of crime lay not in individual moral failure, but in the human capacity for desperation and the willingness to compromise one's integrity when faced with threats to those whom one loved. By mid-December, as the investigation achieved its formal closure and the perpetrators faced prosecution, Maple Crossing began the slow process of attempting to return to normalcy. Though the village would be forever altered by its discovery of how easily institutions dedicated to goodness could be corrupted, and how the desire to protect those we love could lead to the destruction of those around us. The Christmas season arrived in Maple Crossing with a quality of forced cheerfulness that seemed to overlay rather than genuinely displace the darker currents that had been exposed by the investigation. The village attempted to proceed with its traditional observances. The carol service in the church, the Christmas market on the green, the exchange of greetings and pleasantries that marked the season. Yet beneath these familiar rituals lay a current of unease and altered perspectives that no amount of festive decoration could entirely obscure. Reverend David Thornton, the temporary replacement who had arrived to lead the parish following Ashford's arrest, made a conscientious effort to restore the church to a state of spiritual renewal. Yet the parishioners seemed reluctant to invest their trust fully in an institution that had proven so fundamentally vulnerable to corruption. The bishop's office had commissioned a comprehensive review of church finances and administrative procedures across the diocese, a review that revealed similar but less extensive irregularities in 3 other parishes, suggesting that the problem was considerably more widespread than anyone had initially suspected. Miss Marple attended the Christmas carol service, as she had done for decades, and observed with her characteristic acuity the manner in which the congregation had been fundamentally altered by recent events. Certain families had ceased attending entirely, apparently unable to reconcile their sense of betrayal by the institution with their desire to participate in communal worship. Others attended with a kind of grim determination, as though they believed that their presence demonstrated an unwillingness to allow corruption to defeat their faith. Geoffrey Hartwell, the young art teacher who had been inadvertently involved in the circumstances that had contributed to Eleanor's death through the misinterpreted nature of his relationship with Reverend Ashford, sat near the back of the church with visible discomfort, his presence suggesting that he had not entirely freed himself from the guilt and shame of being tangentially implicated in events that he had neither caused nor controlled. It was Thomas Westbrook who appeared most visibly transformed by the investigation's culmination. Having been freed from suspicion regarding Eleanor's death and having witnessed his engagement to Catherine Nash dissolve in the aftermath of her exposed deceptions, he seemed to have undergone a kind of philosophical reorientation regarding the nature of rural life and human relationships. He attended the carol service, accompanied by his elderly mother, a woman named Margaret Westbrook, who had lived in Maple Crossing for 50 years, and who seemed to embody a kind of steadfast acceptance of human frailty that contrasted sharply with the judgment and gossip that characterized much village discourse. After the service concluded, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Thomas as they departed the church, and he mentioned, with a thoughtfulness that suggested considerable internal reflection, that he had decided to pursue a different trajectory for his life and his farm. He had accepted an offer to study agricultural economics at a university in Scotland, a decision that would require him to lease his farm to a neighboring farmer for several years while he completed his education. This decision, he acknowledged, had been motivated not merely by a desire for intellectual advancement, but rather by a recognition that the insularity and interconnected nature of small-town life made genuine personal reinvention difficult, and that the same conditions that allowed Eleanor's murder to remain hidden for days had also created an environment in which individuals found it nearly impossible to escape the judgments and interpretations that the community imposed upon them. Miss Marple listened to this account with quiet understanding, recognizing in Thomas's decision a reflection of the broader impact that the investigation had exerted upon the village's social fabric. The events of the autumn had revealed the degree to which small communities operated through networks of observation, gossip, and collective judgment, mechanisms that could serve to maintain social order and prevent genuine wrongdoing, but which could also trap individuals within interpretations of their character and history from which escape seemed impossible. Meanwhile, as the investigation moved toward its prosecutorial conclusion in the court, Martin Caldwell's criminal enterprise was systematically dismantled by federal and regional authorities. Caldwell himself, rather than face trial and the certainty of substantial imprisonment, negotiated a plea agreement in exchange for providing detailed information regarding the broader networks of organized crime that had extended throughout southern England. His cooperation, authorities indicated, would likely result in prosecutions and convictions extending far beyond the immediate Maple Crossing investigation and would significantly disrupt criminal operations that had operated with near impunity for more than a decade. Adrian Cross, the businessman whose financial fraud had initially appeared to be the central focus of the investigation, ultimately received a sentence of 5 years for his role in the money laundering scheme. A sentence that seemed almost anticlimactic given the magnitude of the broader criminal enterprise that had been exposed. Thomas Ashford, Reverend Ashford's younger brother, negotiated a deal with prosecutors that resulted in a suspended sentence and requirement to cooperate with authorities in exchange for his agreement to testify regarding his involvement in the criminal enterprise and regarding his older brother's reluctant participation in facilitating the laundering operation. This arrangement seemed to satisfy the justice system's requirements, while simultaneously acknowledging the complexity of moral culpability in cases where coercion and familial desperation had driven individuals toward criminal involvement. As Christmas approached its climax and the village settled into the quieter rhythms of the holiday period, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the extraordinary events of the preceding months, and the manner in which a single murder had unraveled to reveal layers of criminality, complicity, and human weakness that had seemed entirely invisible beneath the surface of ordinary village life. She understood that the true lessons of the investigation extended beyond the specific facts of Eleanor Hartley's murder to encompass broader truths about human nature, institutional vulnerability, and the manner in which desperation could lead even fundamentally decent individuals toward criminal activity. The village would slowly heal, relationships would be cautiously reestablished, and life would gradually resume its ordinary patterns. Yet the knowledge of what had been hidden beneath the surface of civility and institutional propriety would remain a permanent alteration in the community's understanding of itself and of the human capacity for deception and self-interest. The new year arrived in Maple Crossing with a kind of quiet dignity that seemed appropriate for a village attempting to move forward from collective trauma, and by mid-January, as the trial of Reverend William Ashford commenced in the regional courthouse, most of the village had settled into a state of cautious normalcy that bore only superficial resemblance to the life that had existed before Eleanor Hartley's murder. The trial itself which was conducted with the kind of legal precision that seemed to strip away the human complexity that Miss Marple had observed throughout the investigation, resulted in a conviction for murder and a life sentence, a verdict that appeared to satisfy both the requirements of justice and the village's need for conclusive resolution. Yet as Miss Marple sat in the courtroom gallery during the final arguments and the judge's pronouncement of sentence, she found herself contemplating not the triumph of legal justice, but rather the tragic dimensions of human weakness that had led a man of God to commit an act of violence in defense of his brother and his own compromised position within a criminal enterprise. She understood, as she had understood throughout the investigation, that comprehending crime required comprehending the specific concatenation of circumstances, desperation, and human frailty that had driven the perpetrator toward action. Reverend Ashford had not been an inherently evil man, but rather a man whose initial compromise of his principles, undertaken to protect his brother from criminal consequences, had gradually ensnared him in a web of criminality from which escape had become impossible. Eleanor's discovery of this web and her threat to expose it had presented him with a choice between allowing his brother to face destruction or eliminating the threat that Eleanor represented. In the moment of desperation, he had chosen the latter course, an action that had seemed in the moment to offer protection, but which had ultimately resulted in far greater destruction than the exposure he had sought to prevent. By February, as winter began its gradual retreat, and the first tentative signs of spring appeared in the form of snowdrops emerging in cottage gardens throughout the village, Miss Marple found herself increasingly withdrawn from the aftermath of the investigation and the continuing reverberations of Ashford's trial and conviction. She had been asked multiple times by Inspector Graves and by various prosecutorial authorities to provide testimony regarding her observations and deductions, a role that she had fulfilled with characteristic precision while simultaneously expressing her discomfort with the public nature of the proceedings. She understood that her involvement in the case had generated a certain kind of local celebrity, with villagers regarding her with a mixture of respect and unease, as though they were simultaneously impressed by her investigative acuity and troubled by the implications of having been observed so carefully by someone who had understood so much about their private affairs and hidden motivations. It was precisely this discomfort that led her, in early March, to make a decision that surprised the village considerably. She announced her intention to retire from the cottage in which she had resided for more than 40 years and to relocate to the seaside town of Worthing, where she had a niece who had invited her to share accommodations in a more temperate climate. The announcement generated considerable comment within the village, with various individuals expressing their shock and dismay at her departure. Yet Miss Marple's decision seemed unshakable, driven by a recognition that the intimacy of village life and the burden of observation that it carried had become, in the aftermath of the investigation, something from which she required respite. She spent her final weeks in Maple Crossing settling her affairs, distributing her accumulated possessions, and engaging in the kind of careful farewell that suggested she did not anticipate returning. On her final afternoon in the village, she received a visitor in her cottage, Thomas Westbrook, who had come to say goodbye and to thank her for her role in clearing his name of suspicion regarding Eleanor's death. During their conversation, he mentioned that he had been accepted into the agricultural economics program at the Scottish University and would be departing within weeks, his decision to leave Maple Crossing now formalized and irreversible. He expressed, with evident sincerity, his belief that Miss Marple had understood the village more thoroughly than any other resident, and that her departure represented a kind of loss that Maple Crossing could not entirely replace. Miss Marple responded to this observation with her characteristic gentleness, suggesting that villages, like all human communities, possessed the capacity to understand and heal themselves if given sufficient time and motivation. She reflected that the events of the autumn had taught Maple Crossing difficult but necessary lessons regarding the dangers of assuming moral superiority, of overlooking institutional vulnerability, and of failing to recognize that evil could emerge from desperation and weakness as readily as from inherent malice. As she prepared for her departure from the village, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection regarding the investigation that had consumed so much of her attention and emotional energy. She had solved Eleanor Hartley's murder, had identified the perpetrator, and had contributed to the exposure of a criminal enterprise that had preyed upon human weakness and institutional corruption. Yet the solution to the crime had revealed not the triumph of justice, but rather the tragic dimensions of human complexity, the manner in which circumstances and desperation could drive fundamentally decent individuals toward actions that violated their deepest moral principles. The village, in moving forward, would carry with it the knowledge of this complexity, and while this knowledge did not excuse Reverend Ashford's crime, it provided a kind of understanding that elevated the case beyond the simple narrative of murderer and victim into something considerably more nuanced and profoundly human. On a gray March morning, as rain fell gently upon the village green and the church bells tolled with their familiar cadence, Miss Marple departed Maple Crossing in a motor car driven by her niece, her possessions packed carefully in trunks and cases, her understanding of the village's hidden complexity preserved in her memory like pressed flowers in the pages of a book. She did not look back as the motor car turned onto the main road leading away from the village, her gaze fixed forward toward whatever future awaited her in the quieter rhythms of seaside retirement. Behind her, Maple Crossing continued its existence, forever altered by the events of the autumn, forever marked by the knowledge that beneath the surface of civility and community lay depths of human nature that required vigilant observation and profound compassion to truly comprehend.